we're going to continue with discussing, of course, about the age of, industrialization, capitalism, of course, that occurred in America, in the late 19th century. And I think we were up to last time. I know we had started talking about the main capitalists, like the so-called robber barons that they sometimes call them. Like we talked about, I know Cornelius Vanderbilt, we had gotten into him, the guy that, had those steamships, and he was like the first railroad tycoon that you had. Then we talked about, that was the Commodore, they called him. Remember the Commodore? And then, of course, we talked about Andrew Carnegie, steel industrialist. His Carnegie Steel Company was real famous. It later was sold to J.P. Morgan, who created U.S. Steel. Then we talked about, the Bessemer process, which he used with his manufacturing of steel. Then we had talked about vertical integration. I think we had talked about that also as well, how Carnegie had dominated his industry by controlling all the means of production of steel, like the stages of it, from the mining, the transportation, the smelting, refining and rolling of steel. And we'll get to later and talk about also what they call horizontal integration, which is not quite the same. That's a little different, but it's going to be where somebody like a company or corporation will control a certain aspect of production, which is pretty important. So yeah, we're going to, of course, continue talking about the rise of industrialization and capitalism. Now, I did want to talk about the big thing, of course, that came about during the industrialization in America was the discovery of like oil, like the first drilling of oil. And of course, one of the most important was Edwin Drake. Edwin Drake, in the late 19th century, developed the first oil well to drill for oil. And people thought he was crazy when he came up with this idea in a place called Titusville, Pennsylvania. And he drilled down like 70 feet into the ground with the first oil well. Of course, he built this first oil rig here. It's like made of wood, you can see. And they called it Drake's Folly, is what they dubbed it. And of course, people laughed at him. But when oil started coming out the ground, like shooting out, and all that, everybody else wanted to get in the action of, drilling for oil. And so people thought that was the main way to control the petroleum industry and all of that. But there was this other guy who came along named John D. Rockefeller. You've probably heard of Rockefeller, who lived from the 19th to the 20th century there. Rockefeller, of course, a very famous American business industrialist, of course, was the so-called founder of Standard Oil Company. Standard Oil Company was one of the first oil companies in the country to really dominate the oil industry, especially in what they call the refining aspect of oil. There was a guy named, it was a bunch of people that did this, but Benjamin Silliman, I think in America, I know, was a famous American chemist. He was one of the first to figure out how to take petroleum and make other things out of it, like isolate it. And Silliman was one of the ones that developed kerosene, which kerosene was the first kind of fuel that they developed from petroleum. And what's going to happen over time is that kerosene will replace what they call whale oil, which was gotten from whales. And so by the end of the 19th century, kerosene becomes the big, fuel everybody starts using. And then eventually gasoline and diesel, will eventually follow later, which are all byproducts of petroleum. So yeah, that's more about Rockefeller. And of course, Rockefeller in his company figured out a way to, dominate the industry, monopolize it. And it became basically like a trust is what it was. It was actually a group of companies that basically controlled the oil business overall. He started in Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio is where, Standard Oil started. And then what happened was it spread to other states. So there's like a Standard Oil of Ohio. There's one in other states, Texas and so on. But basically, it's basically a bunch of states that they control over. And it'll be around as a monopoly until 1911, when it's eventually broken up due to the Sherman Antitrust Act, basically. And back here it is. It was found in 1870. It's broken up in 1911. Standard Oil. That eventually, it was broken up into 34 different companies that are kind of still around today, like Exxon, one of the main ones that broke away from it. Mobil. You could think of what Shell, Gulf, Texaco, Chevron, like any of those, gas companies you get gas from anywhere. It's pretty much goes back to the Standard Oil Company. It's originally called Esso and then later called Exxon. Which I think it's for Eastern Southern Standard Oil Company or something like that is what actually basically. And Exxon merged with Mobil, of course. Exxon Mobil is what they call it. You see on the bottom, basically. Here's a picture of how Rockefeller was able to control his industry. Basically, he figured out that the most strategic aspect, in the whole, development of the oil industry was refining. So if you could control refining, you can pretty much control everything else. And so when you control a certain aspect of an industry, it's called horizontal integration. So basically bought up all the refineries throughout the country pretty much. And then because he owned all the refineries, well, it put all these other guys out of business. So he was able to buy up the oil fields, the barrel factories, and even had all the railroad tanker cars as well. So he was able to basically control everything. That's why it became such a big monopoly over time. So that's a little different from what, I guess Carnegie did it, but pretty much this is what made him such a billionaire because when Rockefeller died I think he lived till like the when did he die? 1930. Yeah, he lived almost 100 years. He was around a long time, Rockefeller. He was a billionaire. He was worth like $1 billion. I think in today's money, that would make it about $6 billion, I think, is what I estimate. So Rockefeller is still considered the most wealthy man there ever was in the world, at least in modern standards overall. Carnegie, by the way, called him Rockefeller with his, Scottish accent. Then they got J.P. Morgan or John Pierpont Morgan. You probably heard of him. Of course, he's very famous. Of course, one of the very few that came from wealthy background. Pretty much all the other guys I talked about, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, all came from poor backgrounds. And he went on to dominate multiple industries. Railroad. He was pretty much a railroad tycoon. Steel, because he, of course, if you know about it, bought up Carnegie's steel company that he had and formed U.S. Steel, which became like one of the first billion-dollar corporations. Electric Industries, and of course, he became famous as American financier. And of course, he's one that pretty much founded what is Chase Manhattan Bank and all that. That's pretty much all associated with him, Chase, and so he was very wealthy, pretty much one of these unscrupulous kind of guys, that probably did practice a lot of illegal monopolies, like all the other ones. So I think that's the big four they always talk about, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. I think Vanderbilt may have been the most honest one of the bunch, and those are the big four in the late 19th century that were, just pretty much dominated their industries. All right, let me go ahead and move on. Let me also talk about American inventors, also entrepreneurs that influenced the industrialism in the United States. This would be part of the Second Industrial Revolution, which kind of starts after the American Civil War, like the 1860s up to really World War I. overall. I've got a lot of them. There's a lot of different inventors, entrepreneurs that influenced the United States. Some of these are people and also companies that they created also as well. We can actually start way back. I'll go back to before the Civil War. I kind of mentioned him too because we haven't talked about this, but yeah, mechanical reapers. That's something that is a big thing that took off in the 19th century, and a lot of the early mechanical reapers were horse-driven, and then over time they started using like engines, like I guess gasoline eventually over time. And that replaced the skiff and people doing stuff by hand, unless you're Amish. And Cyrus McCormick, he had this company called International Harvester, which is in Chicago. They were the first to make these mechanical type reapers that could go out there and cut like wheat and other grains. And then also they started, making a lot of other type of machines, tractors, combines, and so on. It was around for, I forget what did they call the company now, but it was bought up, I know, so many years ago. It's still around, the company, but I forget what the new name of it is. But he's pretty important, Cyrus McCormick. So now I'll get to John Deere later. He was also the other big guy that, transformed a lot of the farming industry with new kinds of machinery. Also, Samuel F.B. Morse, or Samuel Morse, of course, was pretty important. He, along with this other guy named Charles Wheatstone, who's in England, developed the telegraph pretty much, which used electric poles to send messages through the wire to distant places. They developed it in the 1830s originally. And of course, as you know, Morse is known for Morse code, which is the main code they use to send information back and forth. And I think the first message he sent ever was like from Congress. He demonstrated how it was used. I think 1832 may have been when it was, but he sent this message, which was from the Bible, that said, "What has God wrought?" I think is what it was. And you can see here, he even was the first to send a message about like a presidential type election that year in 1844. So that's interesting about that. During the Civil War, they used them, I know, the United States. I know like in wars like Crimean War, American Civil War, they're the first wars to really use the telegraph. So it's like an early form of telecommunications. Before that, you had to mail a letter, which might take a while. I guess the Indians had smoke signals they could send, Anyway, other of course, people that were pretty important besides Samuel Morse, of course, Alexander Graham Bell, who was, I think, Scotland, I believe, or somewhere in England. He's from the UK, I know, who moved to Canada. And Bell later went to Philadelphia and became an inventor. And of course, 1876, he patented the first telephone, which is pretty important. And Bell created the first company to dominate the telephone industry, which was called the Bell Telephone Company, which later became other companies like AT&T and South Central Bell and all these companies you probably heard of that they have later. Like it was a monopoly, and they had to break it up too. It's Bell Telephone Company. So that's who Bell was. I think I've got a slide. Did I add it in there? I thought I did. Where's this one in here? I thought I had on. I guess I don't have him in there. But Cyrus W. Field, he was important in laying the first transatlantic transmission cable, like for telegraph, which connected the United States with Britain. He did that in the 1860s. And so that was kind of seen as pretty important. And the first case where, two countries can communicate with each other overseas. Then there's this Italian American named Guglielmo Marconi, popularized wireless telegraph, which is called radio. He figured out that you send radio waves and send messages, and that led to the invention of radio, like like you listen to your car, like a radio, more news stuff. And so Marconi was pretty important overall. Oh, by the way, going back to some of these telecommunications things too, like with the telegraph and all that, you probably heard of Western Union, right? Western Union became one of the first companies that dealt with telecommunications. And for a long time, they're the ones that control a lot of the telegraph stuff. They don't really use telegraphs much anymore. And then wireless radio, I think Marconi had his own company called the Marconi Wireless Telegram Company or something like that it was called. And if you sent a telegram for him, it was called a Marconigram, basically. Of course, radio tube invented in 1907, you can see, Lee DeForest. And then Vladimir Zorkin is the guy that invented television, which really started back in the 1920s, television. Most people know that. But television really doesn't take off till like the 1950s or something like that. Other guys that are important in America you've probably heard of, John Deere, who started out as a blacksmith. He figured out that you could replace, iron plows with steel plows, which he started making. And that's what made John Deere famous originally, with some of the farming equipment that he made. Then over time, John Deere's company would develop other farming equipment, tractors and so on that it's known for today, et cetera, combines or whatever they have now. It's all kinds of farming equipment that they're known for. But the steel plow, something he developed in the 1830s. Another guy I don't think of, 1843, Charles Goodyear. I never heard of him. I'm sure you heard of Goodyear, like Goodyear tires. And Goodyear was the guy that invented the first vulcanized rubber, which eventually they make out of synthetic material over time. And so that'll be important later for tires on vehicles, especially when they start inventing like tractors and cars and trucks and things like that. So it's pretty much what's on your car. Although early rubber was made from the rubber plant, and then they start using, stuff that's synthetic now. Elijah Otis, you probably heard of him maybe. He's, of course, the guy that invented the elevator in the 1850s, 1857, the Otis elevator. I think they still have these. Of course, still exists, the company. So he demonstrated this, I think, originally in the 1850s. And he even included some kind of brake system that could stop the elevator from falling and all that. So everybody's now got to know about the elevator. So without that, without the elevator, they call it elevator, escalator, really both of them pretty much. But without that, you wouldn't be able to go up like a skyscraper. If you had to go up like 100 floors or whatever without an elevator. It's really elevator. You also invented the escalator too as well. John Roebling, of course, famous engineer. I kind of mentioned him, but he's the one who built the Brooklyn Bridge or designed it and all that. It was the first major steel wire suspension bridge ever constructed. Of course, built in New York City, connects like Manhattan to Brooklyn. It's one of the oldest bridges in the world like that, built in 1869. It's still standing, of course, there in New York City. The typewriter, you don't think much about that, but Christopher Sholes, of course, was the man that invented it, the typewriter. And he even invented they call it the QWERTY keyboard. I think they have different ones now. They have now the QWERTY keyboard, QWERTW. Yeah, QWERTY, whatever they call it, QWERTY. Basically, is he invented where the keys are, where they go and all that. I practically memorized them because I've typed so much, over the years. And I should thank Miss Mackey. She was my typing teacher in high school. I still think about her. Nice lady. Anyway, but he stole the prototype to Remington and Sons, and they're the ones that kind of developed it. And so that's where the typewriter came from. Now it's on computers and on your cell phone and all that. Of course, I just talked about the telephone. Of course, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell. And that was Thomas Watson was his assistant that helped him develop, of course, the telephone. Now, of course, one of the greatest inventors, of this period is Thomas Edison. Edison was one of the greatest inventors, in American history. He's got over 1,000 patents or something like that, crazy. And Thomas Edison had a nickname. He was called the Wizard of Menlo Park, is what they called him. And he had this kind of inventor's lab that he invented or built in Menlo Park, New Jersey. And all of his scientists, engineers would, make different things. And so because of that, he was called the Wizard because people thought a lot of his inventions were magic, which a lot of them weren't. They were very hard to make. In fact, I think Edison once said that his inventions were 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. Or he said, what did he say about the battery? He said, I didn't invent the battery. I invented ways not to invent the battery. Because he had to basically figure ways to make something and find out that it doesn't work that way, basically. Of course, the phonograph was one of his first great inventions, 1877, which you see here. And he recorded the first song ever, which was Mary Had a Little Lamb, which is him singing it. The song. That's the oldest song ever recorded. Yeah. I think when he showed it, I think he went to France or something like that and showed it to a bunch of scientists over there. They thought it was a fraud. They thought, you got a ventriloquist in here somewhere. So, of course, the incandescent light bulb, that's Edison's greatest invention, was the light bulb. They had light before that, but I think they had arc lights and things like that. They were kind of more dangerous. But it was the first practical light bulb. And then Edison went on to develop his own power company called the Edison Electric Company. And later that became part of what is called General Electric. You've heard of today. They dropped the name Edison. The light bulb was the first big thing he did. And he developed electricity for cities, like big cities. With New York City was the first city in America to get electric light. Then they got George Eastman. Of course, he introduced the portable hand camera, Kodak. Everybody's heard of that in the 1880s, Rochester, New York. So that was the first case. They had already had cameras at the time, but it was the first portable handheld one where you can, take a picture yourself. And over time, that's going to, of course, develop into better product, which you see with cameras today, I guess on phones and stuff like that. So George Eastman was the guy that developed the first main portable type camera. Of course, another thing that happened in the United States, they started building subways. Like eventually in the 1890s, they would do this. So the first U.S. subway that was built in Boston, Massachusetts, and it ran from, of course, Boston, from under the Boston Harbor to East Boston. You can see there. So it actually went under the water there, which, of course, a lot of these will do stuff like that. So New York City would get some later. All these other big cities, Chicago and others, would develop their own subways that would follow on down the line. So that helped to create more mass transportation within a city instead of having to walk or whatever. Then you got the Wright brothers that you got. Of course, the Wright brothers were the ones that were the first to develop, the first practical airplane. If you know much about the Wright brothers, they weren't, guys that invented airplanes originally. They were bicycle mechanics that actually owned a bicycle shop in Ohio. They're from Ohio. And they heard about gliders in the late 1800s. So they had some people already trying to develop the early airplane. at that point, and they think the Wright brothers got the idea of developing the airplane from other people that had already been designing gliders, and also from seeing like birds fly in the air. So they built the first airplane, which I don't really have it there, but it was called here it is right there, the first airplane. It was called the Wright Flyer, named after them. And there's like several of these they built, the Wright Flyer 1, 2, and so on. And they went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which is kind of on the outer banks of North Carolina on the East Coast. And they began testing gliders first, and then of course they put engines and propellers on the airplane. They flew the first airplane in 1903. So Orville, you see here, was kind of lying down when they fly the first airplane. I know, flew the first airplane. That's his brother Wilbur, kind of watching right here. Didn't get off the ground very far, but within so many years, the Wright brothers became real popular. Their ideas spread to like across America and Europe and all that. And by World War I, they start using them in warfare, and it revolutionized, pretty much transportation after that. Yeah, it did increase the demand for oil, which is true, along with like the automobile and so on. Of course, that would follow. Of course, that's the other thing, of course, that's very famous, about American history, of course, is the development of the automobile. Now, the automobile was not developed in the United States. If you know about the Germans were the first to develop an automobile. In fact, Mercedes-Benz is considered one of the first companies to mass produce automobiles in the world. And but Henry Ford was one of the first to mass produce automobiles in the United States using interchangeable parts. And he did several things that's very famous, Henry Ford. One, which you don't see in there, well, I guess they kind of do show that. He was famous for developing like a type of assembly line to build automobiles. And what he would do is he would have his workers basically build a part of the car instead of the whole car. And so as it went down an assembly line, they would put a certain part on the car, and it would continue on down the line, and another worker would put another part on until it's finished, basically. So he was the first to actually do that, come up with the idea of the assembly line and all that. And then he also mass-produced one of the first cars, which was the Model T, which I guess you're kind of looking at right there, the Model T, and I think which was developed in 1908. The Model T was later nicknamed the Tin Lizzie. It's almost like a tin can on wheels. And the joke about the Tin Lizzie was that you could get it in any color as long as it's black. They mostly painted cars back in those days, so they just wouldn't rust. If you weren't worried about what color it was and all that, like they do now, I guess. A lot of them were pretty flimsy cars and would break down pretty easily, but the cars themselves were pretty cheap. I think by, I want to say the 1920s, you can get an automobile for like $700, $800. That's not much, but back then that was still a lot of money to buy a car. And his workers were like some of the best paid at the time in the United States. They were getting paid pretty good. I forget how many. It was like $5 a day or something, which was pretty good for that time period or something like that. And Ford Motor Company became one of several, famous companies or corporations that built automobiles in this country. The big ones, were Ford, General Motors, and of course the other one, which is what is it? Plymouth and all that. Chrysler Corporation, I guess it's still around. Also, people forget about Westinghouse. Also, Westinghouse Electric Company. George Westinghouse was this inventor and also guy developed a company for mostly technologies. And Westinghouse, it was like an electric company pretty much, but it had other stuff it did also as well. One of the things he originally did, Westinghouse, he was like an inventor, and Westinghouse had been the one that developed air brakes and trains, which made him kind of wealthy. And then from there, he began to look into other technologies. And one thing he was very interested in was electrical stuff, like electrical transmission lines and technology like that. And he met this guy named Nicholas Tesla. You might have heard of him. Tesla was a Serbian-American inventor, electrical engineer, who had first worked for Thomas Edison, which he didn't get along with. About Tesla and Edison, they argued over the they call it the current wars, like what they should use, whether it should be alternating current versus direct current. And Tesla wanted alternating current. He thought it was more safer to use. And then, of course, Edison wanted direct current and all that. And so anyway, that was one thing at Westinghouse, started using alternating current with electricity and transmission lines and all that. And so that became popular. He also developed the first commercial radio broadcast. You can see there. He built the first submarine, his company, as well. So he's done a lot of things. Westinghouse has kind of been around and all that. And so he made it kind of into an economic powerhouse overall. Then we talked about earlier George Washington Carver in that short little video at the beginning. Carver was a very famous African-American scientist, inventor, mostly to do with like agricultural products and changes. And he was an ex-slave. He was supposed to be born in the 1860s as a kind of a slave child, and then eventually was a homesteader, believe it or not, in the West. In Kansas. Like I remember talking about the whole Homestead Act, he actually was a homesteader for like farming land and stuff like that, and got real interested in agriculture. He's also an artist. Most people don't know that either about Carver. He was an artist originally. He wanted to be an artist, actually. And he went to Iowa State University eventually and got multiple degrees. Never got a PhD, though. But he was mostly a botanist. If you know about that. What happened was Booker T. Washington invited him to come to Tuskegee Institute, now called University in Alabama, where he headed up pretty much their agricultural department and all of that. And from there, he began developing a reputation where he began a lot of research. And one of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to find new crops that farmers in the South could use to replace cotton. Why? If you know much about what happened in the early 1900s, cotton industry almost got wiped out because of the boll weevil epidemic and all that. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but my great-grandfather owned a mercantile store in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. He dealt with a lot of farmers, like cotton farmers, probably mostly. And his business went bankrupt in the 1910s. Because of the boll weevil epidemic. In fact, he was in partner with this other guy who was a banker, and he went bankrupt too, because I found some information about it, genealogy. So yeah, a lot of people went out of, they couldn't farm cotton as much because of the boll weevil epidemic. So he came up with the idea for farmers to grow peanuts, soybeans, sweet potatoes, etc., and pecans, you can see also as well. And so he even came up with the idea to make products out of them, which I think he even had guides on how to make certain things out of it, which weren't really that popular, believe it or not, later. But people joke about him. Peanuts is the big thing he made popular, Carver. And so a lot of people called him later Mr. Peanut, about that. So he's won a lot of awards. Pretty much by the 1940s when he died, he was pretty much had a big reputation in the United States, worldwide, and all of that. So that's who George Washington Carver was. Also, a few more things I'll add to that were also in the late 19th century that started to, mail order catalogs. You don't think much about that anymore. People don't buy stuff in catalogs much anymore. But these guys here, Montgomery Ward and Sears and Roebuck. Those were the first two companies that really created mail order catalogs. Most of these were developed for people that lived in rural areas where you could buy something and they could ship it to your house, like whatever it is, basically. And even a house or something, or clothes, or whatever you wanted, they could ship it to you, tools. And so over time, these became stores, if you know about it, like Montgomery Ward. You probably never heard of Montgomery Ward, but it used to be a big store in Baton Rouge called Montgomery Ward. I remember I used to go there when I was a kid, buy TVs or whatever. Sears, of course, still around today. It's actually called Sears and Roebuck. They just call it Sears for short. Of course, they're not doing so well, Sears, if you know about it, because of Amazon. You know, kind of seems like it's putting out a lot of these like brick and mortar type stores, you know, out of business. So 1870s is where Montgomery Ward got started. And Sears at one point was one of the largest companies that did that sold stuff like that. They still make pretty good tools and stuff like that. You know, can't go wrong with that as well. Oh, also, I don't know if you heard of Frank Woolworth, but Woolworth was a famous store that used to be around. It's not anymore. But, you know, you had a Dollar General and stores like that today that you've got. Basically, Woolworth was like the first example of that. They call it a five and dime store where you could buy stuff real cheap. And so Woolworth was one of the first stores to really do that. All right, so pretty much that's it lecture-wise for this section, for those two lectures. Let me go through and look at pretty much what we've covered review-wise for this period here. This is our first exam material later. So it says, what was big business development? The robber barons were captains of industry. Well, big business, what I'm talking about is the development of these type of capitalist type industries, companies and corporations that would be created by mostly famous entrepreneurs, industrialists. These would, of course, replace a lot of your small businesses, which I told you is mostly what you had before, like the Civil War. Most people owned like mills or whatever. And then after the Civil War, you start seeing these companies and corporations start taking over everything. It's pretty much all the industries, manufacturing, whatever. And of course, I told you that depending on who you were, like if you're lower classes or something, like poor people, you might call the industrialists robber barons because you felt like they were kind of doing things in unscrupulous ways, dishonest or whatever, making money or whatever. And then other people called them captains of industries, capitalists, you know, and they're kind of seen as both, I guess. Depends on your perspective with that. I told you the food industry was one of the first industries that really got it going. You know, capitalism in the late 19th century, and because, you know, cattle and things like that, food that people want throughout the country. So Gail Borden, I told you about, was one of the first industrialists that came up with the idea to create like canned milk. Well, it sounds stupid, but something that people needed, especially in the Civil War, when you couldn't, you know, get milk from a cow, which spoiled easily. So he did that, and he was one of the first to dominate the milk industry. Seems to be declining too for some reason. People don't want to drink milk. I love milk, you know. H.J. Heinz, I think I'm talking about Heinz, another famous guy that kind of dominated a lot of the like you know, not just ketchup, but canned vegetables and other things like that as well. So that was another one. Meat packing industry started like Chicago, St. Louis, a lot of the major cities in the Midwest. Gustavus Swift, Philip Armour were the two big guys that started that. Armour, of course, was the guy, you remember correctly, that was the first to really dominate the meat packing industry, like Chicago. And I told you he developed a kind of a disassembly process of how they would take apart animals and use them. So everything, just about all the parts of pig, whatever they would use overall. Gustavus Swift was in the meat packing industry too. He was the one, of course, that developed the first refrigerator cars. They used railroads to ship meat products, whatever, all over the place. And I talked about the famous capitalists, you know, late 19th century that were big, that some people call it robber barons, all that. You had, of course, Cornelius Vanderbilt, of course, first, who was called the Commodore. And of course, Vanderbilt was one of the first tycoons to dominate like steamships in this country. So he built like a whole huge bunch of steamships. Of course, the United States, that was pretty dominant. And then he sold those and he went into like the railroad business. It was a railroad tycoon. So they do consider Vanderbilt to be the first railroad tycoon, like developing the New York Central Railroad and all of that. Vanderbilt also, of course, helped establish Vanderbilt University, of course, in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, if you've ever been to the Biltmore, you ought to go there one day if you ever can in Asheville, North Carolina. But the Biltmore is a famous mansion that the Vanderbilts built. And that was one thing about these robber barons were capitalists like this. They were real showy, building these huge mansions and stuff like that they had. I think so. We call it conspicuous consumption or something like that's what they dubbed it. Andrew Carnegie, of course, dominated the steel industry in the United States. He's pretty much the guy that got it started. Carnegie was originally Scottish, came to the United States in the 19th century to what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he developed his own company later called the Carnegie Steel Company, basically. He used what they call the Bessemer process, which was invented in England by Henry Bessemer. That was a process where they turned pig iron into carbonized steel, basically. Carnegie also used vertical integration. What was that? Vertical integration was where you dominate certain industry by controlling all the means of production and everything, from the, controlling the mines, from the developing of, the steel mills and all that, the railroads and the rolling of steel and all that. All that, he controlled the whole industry of it. And he became so wealthy, Carnegie, that he sold it to J.P. Morgan, who developed U.S. Steel. But remember, Carnegie was kind of more nicer, I guess, compared to some of the other ones. He gave a lot of his wealth away, like $400 or $500 million of it. So, because he didn't want to die a rich person. Still rich anyway. Now I'll tell you about John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, of course, was the founder of Standard Oil, which I told you was this oil company that dominated the petroleum industry by monopolizing it as a trust. Edwin Drake was the first guy that really, like I said, first, entrepreneur, business guy that drilled the first oil well in the United States. A place called Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. He struck oil, and that's what made petroleum popular in the United States later. So other guys got into it, like basically Rockefeller got in on it, and then about 11 years, he had founded his, of course, Standard Oil. What was horizontal integration? Horizontal integration was where basically Rockefeller figured out that he could control the oil industry by controlling how they, refine the petroleum. So refining is how you control it, and so he was able to monopolize the oil industry all over the place in the United States because of it. Standard Oil, of course, was broken up. I told you in 1911, broken up like in 30-something different companies, corporations now, because of this Sherman Antitrust Act. So it was declared illegal as a monopoly or trust by the Supreme Court. Then we talked about all the different famous inventors, entrepreneurs in American history that were big. Cyrus McCormick, I'll tell you about him. He was this manufacturer up in Chicago that developed the first mechanical reapers, for harvesters, for harvesting grain, which were first horse-driven and then later mechanical by, I guess, gasoline, diesel, whatever. Samuel Morse invented, of course, one of the first guys that invented the telegraph and Morse code. Of course, he's very famous, Morse, today still. Cyrus W. Field was the guy that business guy that developed the transatlantic telegraph transmission lines that went under the ocean that connected what is the United Kingdom with the United States. So that was the first case where you had telecommunications between more than one country that you have later. Alexander Graham Bell, 1876, of course, invented the telephone, which of course also changed a lot of telecommunications later as well. Bell was known for his Bell Telephone Company, which monopolized the telephone industry for a while until it was broken up as also. Guglielmo Marconi was, of course, Italian-American, who helped develop the wireless telegraph, radio, and he was one of the first to develop his own company that did that, which was called the Marconi Wireless Telegram Company. John Deere, of course, John Deere Company or corporation. I guess it's a company still. And Deere, of course, was famous for developing the steel plow. And then his company went on to develop a lot of farming equipment that's well known today. So John Deere. Charles Goodyear, of course, American inventor, was the guy that, of course, developed the first really synthetic rubber, I guess. Started developing like tires for vehicles, later for automobiles and trucks and tractors and things like that. So that Goodyear, Goodyear Firestone, you always hear about today. So he was the first in that to do that. Elijah Otis developed like the elevator, escalator, things like that. Which are around today still, most of the elevator. John Roebling, of course, was a famous engineer, American engineer. He, of course, was the one that built the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, which connects New York City, Manhattan to what is Brooklyn. So Christopher Sholes, of course, invented the typewriter. Of course, very big invention now today, typewriter, which he sold later. Thomas Edison, famous American inventor, of course, known as the Wizard of Menlo Park, known for his great inventions, like the phonograph originally, incandescent light bulb. Oh, you probably don't know this, but Edison was the one that also developed the movie camera, practically helped invent Hollywood. In fact, he made the first movie, I think, also as well. George Eastman, of course, Kodak, of course, New York, pretty much developed the first handheld practical camera that you could use yourself overall, late 19th century. Wright brothers, Orville, Wilbur Wright, of course, were the first to develop and fly the first airplane, Gideon, North Carolina, 1903. Henry Ford had his Ford Motor Company. Of course, Ford was very instrumental in developing the first practical automobile called the Model T, and Ford popularized the idea of the assembly line in use in manufacturing and all of that. George Westinghouse, of course, was a famous inventor, developing, of course, Westinghouse Electric Company Corporation, and he was involved in a lot of different things. The big thing that Westinghouse involved in was, of course, electrical stuff, electrical transmission lines, and he helped popularize AC, alternating current over direct current, which I told you was heavily influenced by Nikola Tesla. Of course, we talked about George Washington Carver. Carver was an African-American scientist, agriculturalist, botanist, that popularized the use of other products like plants, like peanuts, sweet potatoes, pecans, etc. Said one of the greatest, probably African-American scientists that dealt with agriculture. It's well known today. There's a lot of schools named after, of course, George Washington Carver. Mostly famous at Tuskegee University, which was called back then Institute. Sears and Roebuck, and also Aaron Montgomery Ward were the first Americans to develop the idea of mail order catalogs to sell goods to people. They also developed the first brick and mortar companies that kind of did stuff like that overall. This has happened in the late 19th century. And Frank Woolworth, was this American that came up with the idea of developing stores that would sell cheap goods to people, like a brick and mortar store, like a Dollar General, which was called a five and dime type store, which these were around for a long time, up until like the late 20th century. I think Woolworth, Montgomery Ward was too. But only Sears is still around, of course, today. So that's pretty much it for, of course, this topic we're talking about, which is the rise of industry and capitalism. I guess nobody has any questions or comments about my lecture today. If you do, let me know, I guess right now, or you can also, don't forget, you can comment, of course, later about, the lecture. Make sure, don't forget to, comment, ask questions about my lectures on YouTube. Let me just remind you all about that. But we do get bonus points for that, of course. But if anybody has a question right now, I'll take it, or any kind of comment you want, ask me about. That's fine. But anyway, before we go, let me just remind you about a few things for this week, of course, and next week. Remember, don't forget, you have a couple assignments due. The ones that are due now is the video quiz, of course, is on that Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, worth 50 points. That was due today, but I did give you 2 more days on it, so it is due Thursday. So I got 2 more days. I'll let you kind of finish that up. I'll keep reminding you till Thursday, I guess, about that. And then the other one is on the Gilded Age. That's the one on the politics and corruption, all that, which is worth 100 points. So that one is also due by Thursday as well. And I was trying to think of some other reminders. Of course, like I said, next week, getting close to finishing. I know this week and next week. I don't know if we'll finish everything on Thursday. I'll try. I know we got to talk about labor unions, farmers organizations, the rise of populism. I think that's the last topics I do have on the first exam. So it's probably today and Tuesday next week I should wrap up for y'all's first exam. That's going to be an online first exam, which I'll have on Tuesday, September 22nd. Okay. Now, I think I already told you it's going to be kind of maybe around 40 questions or so. So it's a lot lengthier quiz, a lot longer time too. I'll give you. You will get 2 attempts on it, like, the quizzes. So that's it for today. I guess nobody has any questions for me right now. You're on YouTube right now or StreamYard. But if you got any comments later about this lecture or a question, send me a message through YouTube about either whatever one it is. It doesn't matter. I don't care about this one or the previous one is, of course, fine. So that's it for today. I hope y'all have a great evening, and I'll see you Thursday, of course, with another lecture, or those that are looking at it later.